all hear me now. A very warm welcome from Berlin, Germany, where we are speaking today with Elizabeth Thompson from the National Collegiate Athletics Association. And Elizabeth will be telling us about how to go about sports scholarships in the United States. I want to send out a very warm welcome to all people listening in today. Yeah, and we will record the session. We are at least, yeah, we will try to record this session and make the recording available online afterwards. Elizabeth, why don't you introduce yourself a bit and talk about what you're doing, and then go into your presentation.
You're located. I'm Elizabeth Thompson with the NCAA Eligibility Center, and I oversee our international outreach and education. So that is our efforts in order to educate the world at an earlier age as to what sport scholarship opportunities are available in order to attend a university within the United States. So what we are doing is trying to educate at a younger age of what those academic requirements are and the information in order to obtain a sports scholarship. So our agenda for today, we will talk about the options to attend a university, how to become eligible both academically and as an amateur in your sport, what resources we have available for you, and then some best practices when it comes to recruiting. So how to promote yourself, how to learn about the recruiting processes that coaches go about in the United States. So there are several options when considering participating in a sport at an NCAA school, as well as other schools. So most people have only heard of the NCAA, but there are actually two other organizations which offer sports as well for at the college level within the United States, that being the NAIA as well as the NJCAA. So those are two other organizations. The NJCAA is typically junior colleges or community colleges in the United States, which offer 2-year degrees. Students may sometimes start at an NJCAA school and then transfer for their final 2 years of university to an NCAA or NAIA college or university. And then in addition to sports at those programs, each university also offers club and intramural sports. So what that means is that if they aren't receiving a scholarship through the athletic department for an NCAA sponsored sport, which we'll cover what those sports are in a few moments, they may participate in a club sport on the team. So for example, sports like sailing or rugby are not NCAA sponsored sports, meaning they don't have a championship and a large enough a number of schools participating in it to be able to be funded through that. So the club teams may be available at some universities.
We'll try to do the shift. So the
Perfect. Okay. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So there are also intramural sports, and that's when students may just get together with friends on campus and sign up to play with other students on campus, and it's much more informal. It's just something fun to do. That there are no scholarship opportunities for those. Okay. So next we will talk about what is the NCAA. where I work. We are made up of almost 1,200 colleges and universities with over 500,000 student athletes active each year, which makes up a total amongst all of those universities and their athletic programs, 19,500 teams total. And each year we sponsor 90 championship sports between men's and women's across our 3 divisions. In total, there are 24 different sports that are offered with NCAA scholarships. So just a bit of information about what is the difference between a Division 1, 2, or 3 university, and how it's determined whether a university is Division 1, 2, or 3. So typically, we look at the number of men's and women's sports that are offered. Schools offering more men and women's sports tend to be Division 1, and then the less that they offer typically moves down to the Division 2 and 3. Also, the size of the student body. Division 1 typically, not always, but typically are very large universities that have as many as 40 or 50,000 students in attendance at those universities, while Division 2 and Division 3 are smaller. So Division 2 universities may only have 4,000 to 5,000 students, while a Division 3 university may only have 1,000 students. And as well, along with those number of student bodies comes their athletics budget. Division 1 universities typically have a very large budget, which results in very large athletic facilities where a large number of fans can come and attend their different sporting events. What's interesting that most people don't know about the 3 divisions is while Division 1 is the most popular when it comes to televised matches or games or publicity, actually the largest number of student athletes are at the Division 3 level. So you'll see on this image here on the slide that 39% of all total student athletes actually attend a Division 3 university. But one interesting thing to know is that Division 3 universities do not offer sports scholarships. So all scholarships that students receive to a Division 3 university are tied to academics. So they do offer scholarships. It's just that it's coming from their academic financial aid sector. So based on how strong the student is and not based on any athletic participation. Okay, so here's just a brief list where you can see our 24 sports that are offered. And you'll see that there are 46 women's sports and 41 men's sports or championships annually. So a lot of times you'll see where some sports may be offered only for women and not for men as a championship sport, such as rowing. Women's rowing is a NCAA sponsored sport, while the men's is actually a club sport. So the reason for that is that Title IX in the United States law says that for every men's sport offered, there has to be an equal women's sport funded as well at the university. However, at some universities, they don't always carry the men's sport in some areas. Women's bowling, women's field hockey, beach volleyball for women, those are other examples of sports that are funded for women based on the number of universities involved with those sports. But for on the men's side, it's at the club level. Okay. So next we'll talk about how to become eligible for the NCAA. And the first step is to register. So if you are thinking about this process, but maybe it's early on and you're just hopeful, but you haven't had any real conversations with coaches, or you just don't know if ultimately a U.S. university is where you want to end up, then what I would recommend doing is creating a free profile page on our website. So those are for students that maybe they'll end up going to a Division 3 university where you don't have to go through the Eligibility Center, or maybe they just aren't sure if they'll go all together. So that free profile page is really a way to start by putting your information in and then receiving reminders from us at the Eligibility Center on how to become eligible, best practices, things that you should do to work towards becoming eligible. So that's really the benefit of the profile page. And then once you become more serious about it, or maybe have some initial conversations with any US coaches at universities, you can then transition that profile page over to what we call a certification account. And what that account does is that's the account where coaches can then actively recruit you. You can send in your transcripts and your test scores. The universities can monitor to make sure that you're on track to become eligible. And it's where ultimately you would be certified as eligible for your scholarship. And again, that's for students wishing to enroll at an NCAA Division I or II university. So what we'll cover today, and I'll go into more depth about this, are what that you need to do in order to academically be eligible for a scholarship. So the four biggest things to take away from that are that you must be a high school graduate. So you must present an acceptable form of proof of secondary graduation. You must complete the 16 NCAA core course credits in the correct subjects, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. You also must earn a minimum GPA within those 16 subjects on average of a 2.3 for Division I or a 2.2 for Division II. And in this presentation, I'll explain more about how we calculate a US GPA for all of the countries around the world. And then lastly, an SAT or an ACT score is required in order to become eligible for that scholarship. And that score must line up with the GPA that you earn on what we call a sliding scale. And I'll talk about that scale more as well. So here is an example of an excerpt from our International Standards Guide. So there will be a link at the end of this presentation with information of how to access that. But we have an international guide made up of over 140 countries listing the timelines, the acceptable forms of proof of high school graduation, and how those grading scales convert from your country to the NCAA initial eligibility process. So because we are broadcasting from Berlin today, I did want to provide our sample scenario here to be in for the country entry of Germany. So you'll see the most common diploma that German students receive is referred to as the Abitur, and you'll see that listed as the first acceptable form of proof of high school graduation. Every country will have their own list of diplomas or certificates that are acceptable to be considered a high school graduate for purposes of scholarship eligibility. So next we talked about having to have 16 core course credits. So most people ask, what is a core course? Here are a few sample titles. We look at coursework taken from your 9th year of education in your country through the expected timeline for graduation. And that expected timeline would be listed under every document that we just showed on the previous slide. So I say taken in years through 9 through 12 because that's the most common in Germany, but you would want to see what the expected timeline is for your country if you're attending a country or school in a country other than Germany. So examples are English courses, math courses, science, social science, and then some additional core courses. So English is fairly straightforward if you've taken English from year 9 or up. Also, if you're in a country where English is not the native language, we will also consider native language courses as being acceptable for core course credit. So a student in Germany who studies German all 4 years as well as English would be able to use the best of those courses towards that requirement. And for mathematics, we look at the Algebra 1 level and up. So a lot of students have Math 9, Math 10, Math 11 each year, and those are seen as being at the Algebra 1 level or higher. But for transcripts that show the actual subject title of the course, such as geometry, calculus, pre-calculus, statistics, algebra 2, all of those are acceptable mathematics courses for eligibility. And then for science courses, we're looking at courses like biology, chemistry, physics, anatomy, physiology, all of those are acceptable science courses. And for social sciences, those are going to be your history, your geography, civics, citizenship, law, psychology, world history. Those are all acceptable courses that we see. One of the most common questions that we get when it pertains to social science are, what about business courses? So business courses actually do not count towards the 16 core course requirements because those are seen as a specialized area and not the general core subject areas. And then lastly, we require additional core courses such as a foreign language. So if you're in Germany studying German and English, but maybe you also studied Russian or Latin or Spanish, those courses could be considered towards this requirement as well. When it comes to religion courses taken anywhere in the world, the only religion courses that will count towards the NCAA eligibility would be world religion courses. So that means courses that are not specific to any one doctrine or religion, but that cover all of the or many of the religions of the world. So now that we've explained what a core course is, next, this is just a kind of a little screenshot to show you where those 16 core courses are required. So they are broken down into each of the subject areas as to what you have to have, 4 of which being your English or native language, 2 being the science, 3 credits coming from math, 2 from social science, and then 1 additional credit can come from either the English native language, the science, or the math area. So if you have studied English and native language and have 8 of those credits, you could use 5 towards English and native language, and that would cover that additional 1 credit that's listed there. And then the last additional column could be extras from any of those. So if you studied mathematics for 4 years and we only needed 3, we could use the extra one in the additional category. But that's also where those foreign language courses can also be used, as well as the world religion or general philosophy courses. So that's Division 1. Division 2 is very similar. You'll see that they also require 16 core course credits. However, where those credits are distributed are slightly different. There are more in the additional areas. So typically, if a person is eligible for Division 1, they're most commonly becoming eligible for Division 2 as well with the 16 credits. So next we'll talk about the GPA and understanding how we calculate a GPA for every country. So the first thing to understand is the US alpha scale and how that converts to what we call a 4-point GPA system. So when you're calculating a grade point average to a US grade point average, a 4.0 is considered the highest grade possible. That's the perfect grade, and that's worth a letter grade of an A is worth those 4 quality points, as we call them, to the 4.0 GPA. And you'll see that each letter grade as it goes lower is worth less points. So a student who is a B average student would have a 3.0 GPA. If a student had maybe half of their grades being Bs and half of their grades being As, when you average them, you would typically come out to what we call a 3.5 GPA. That would be the average of a 4 and a 3 becoming a 3.5. And Fs do not receive any credit towards the GPA, so obviously that can lower your GPA some. So in looking at the grading scales, here's an example of Germany's scale, and that is considered for NCAA purposes. What we would do is we would take the grade that is issued on the transcript, such as in Germany, we consider a grade of a 7 through a 12 to be a B grade to the US system for NCAA eligibility purposes. So if a student had all 7 through 12s on their transcripts, looking at those 16 best core courses, then they would be considered having a 3.0 GPA. So these grading scales will be listed in, if your country is listed in that international guide of over 140 countries, there will be a grading scale or multiple grading scales listed in your country's entry, and that's where you can find the grades that your country issues and how those are going to be considered when calculating your NCAA GPA. It's also important to note that every admissions office has their own conversions. So when you go to apply to a U.S. university to be admitted, it's important to know that they may calculate the GPA differently. So I also spoke a bit about what we called a sliding scale. So how that works is that your test scores and your GPA are both looked at in order to determine if you are academically eligible for a scholarship. So the lower the GPA that you have, then that means the higher the test score requirement is for eligibility. That's put in place so that students that may not be as strong test takers can make up for that with their GPA, or students that may not be as strong in the classroom but might be better test takers have the ability to still become eligible. So you will see the SAT scale, which we look at the critical reading and the math sections to come up with your total score, and how that works. So the lowest that you can be to be fully academic eligible is a 2.3 GPA. So anything below that means that you can only be an academic redshirt, which means that you would only be able to practice with the team the first year, but not compete in any games. So to be fully eligible to play and attend the university on scholarship your first year, you would have to have a 2.3 GPA or higher. So if your GPA goes higher, so if you look on the left-hand side of the scale, you'll see a 3.5 GPA. That's between the A and the B that we talked about. If you have that high of a GPA, you only have to have a 430 SAT score, versus if you only had a 2.3, you would need a 980 SAT score. So you'll see two columns of SAT on the scale. Just refer to the one on the left that says new SAT, unless you took an SAT prior to March of 2016. So SAT just went through some test changes and some scoring changes a few years ago. So that's why two different scales had to be listed on the guide, because we do have some students that took them that early on, but eventually that column will phase out as well. So once you've registered with us and once you've understood a bit about the academic requirements, the next step is to have your academic documents sent to the Eligibility Center. So we ask for your school to email us transcripts for school years 9 and up. The only people that can email is your school, or a Ministry of Education within your country. Otherwise, those dues have to be sent through the mail in a sealed school envelope. But if someone at your school, like an academic advisor or a guidance counselor, can email from a school designated email address, then they can send those to us. But we would need transcripts for years 9 and up, and we require those in the native language, as well as a certified line-by-line English translation. Oftentimes, we see where secondary schools internationally can provide that translation, and that's acceptable. But if your particular school does not provide an English translation, then you would just need to have a certified translator do that translation and mail that to us. Next, you'll need to have proof of graduation sent as well. For some countries, that includes certificates, diplomas, or even potentially final leaving exams that have to be sat for and the results released before you'll know if you have that proof of graduation. And then again, an SAT or ACT test score. If you register with SAT or ACT, you can have your scores sent to the code 9999. So that's 4 nines when you register, and that will have College Board or ACT send those scores electronically to us as soon as the results become available. And then it's free for you that way. So if you go back to College Board after you've taken the test, I think they charge $5 or $10 to send them. But if you do it at the time of registration, they'll send them for free. So I know that you probably are wondering, where does the TOEFL play in all of this? So students often do need a TOEFL still if they're coming from a non-English language country with English not being the primary language. Admissions offices typically still require that for admissions to the university. However, it's not a requirement for the NCAA. So you would not need to have your TOEFL scores sent to us because we are a separate process than the admissions offices on campus. So kind of leading into that, I just want to point out that the NCAA Eligibility Center process is a separate process from the university admissions, which means according to US laws, we cannot release your transcripts or your personal information to those admissions offices. So you would have to apply to the admissions offices on your own merit and submit your documents to them to be admitted, because every university has its own admissions requirements. So some universities may require a 3.0 GPA or a different type of diploma, and they may calculate grades differently. So it's just important to remember that you still have to apply to the university, look at their website and find out what their admissions requirements are, and then just be sure that you're sending your transcripts and test scores to the admissions office as well as to us at the Eligibility Center. Okay, so next we will talk about the sports participation aspect of it. So I mentioned that you have to be eligible academically for a scholarship, but you must also be considered an amateur in your sport. So next we'll talk about just a few tips to remember to stay eligible to be able to compete in college before full-time enrollment. So a few things that we always recommend just being careful of, and then if you have contacts or questions about that, feel free to contact us with those questions. Delaying your full-time collegiate enrollment to participate in organized competition. So what that means is if you take any significant amount of time off after completing or graduating from high school to continue to compete in your sport and you do not enroll at a university, then you have less seasons or years available to participate at a Division 1 or 2 school. So an example would be Division 1 soccer, football. The rule says that you have one gap year after your expected date of graduation. So you have to graduate on time from high school. You get one gap year. And then if you do not enroll full time at a university, and you continue to participate in organized competition. And when I say organized, I mean score was kept, uniforms were worn, all of those type of things. There was an official present. Those are things that make it what is considered time was kept to be an organized competition. You would actually begin to lose seasons. So every student has 5 years at a university to have 4 years of eligibility. So if you compete beyond that 1 year, then you would only maybe have 3 years left, and it would continue to decrease as the years go on. Any significant playing time with professionals or a professional team, signing a contract with a professional team, accepting payment or prize monies, what we consider to be called preferential benefits. So if anyone is trying to provide you, money or things of monetary value like a car or extra benefits with the hopes that they will someday represent you or currently represent you, then those are things that can jeopardize your amateurism and make it where you would not be eligible to earn a scholarship. And then the involvement with the recruiting services, most recruiting services follow all of the rules and are great, but there are a few out there that aren't as aware of the NCAA rules, so some of the things that they do may jeopardize your amateurism, so we always recommend contacting us before signing with any recruiting service, and we'll talk about some of those best practices here shortly. So one thing is our resources, and this is where you can access this information at any time. There are links to our website on here as well as our social media pages, so just be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for regular updates and reminders to stay on track for your eligibility. If you'd like more information on our National Letter of Intent, you can find our link there. And then I spoke earlier and referenced our International Standards Guide. That link is found below, as well as the guide for the college-bound student athlete. So now we'll talk about recruiting rules. So as I mentioned, there are many recruiting services out there that are great, but there are a few that may operate in a way that could actually be considered more of an agent than it would be a legitimate recruiting service based on NCAA rules. So just a reminder that not to sign an agreement with a service which you promise to pay them based on your placement at a university or upon receipt of a scholarship. So as a best practice, recruiting services really should just charge a flat fee to all students, regardless of placement or scholarship, but just for the actual service of helping you navigate the recruiting process. Also, another thing to be aware of is that if the amount of payment that you owe them is based on a percentage of the scholarship dollars that you receive, that's another issue. You may want to make sure to avoid that. And just never let a recruiting service agent fill out any NCAA forms on your behalf, because ultimately you are the one that is held accountable for any false information that they provide. So just be sure, even if they're helping translate or understand what you're filling out, just be sure that you're the one actually doing that and reviewing the information. So in the guide to the college-bound student athlete, which I mentioned earlier, listed here, we have what's called a recruiting calendar. And so that means that there are only certain times of the year and during certain years of your high school timeline that coaches can have contact with you. So we have periods that are called what we call dead periods, which mean coaches are not allowed to have contact with recruits, especially during their season when they're trying to stay busy focusing on the season, but then also to just make sure that students are not bombarded by coaches at a very young age. We want them to be able to be focused on their schooling for years before that process begins. It's just important to note that that recruiting calendar is written in the form of American high school year terms. So year 9 will be referred to as freshman year 10 sophomore year, 11 being junior year, and then year 12 being senior year. So here's an example of the recruiting calendar. This is it. There is one for Division 1 as well as Division 2, and then it's broken down into each year. So you'll see here that this one in particular is for sophomore year, and then it's broken down by sports as well. So men's basketball and men's football just being the largest number of student athletes that we see. So that's why those sports, due to the high recruiting around those sports, have a little bit more specific rules than all other sports. But you'll see that in sophomore year, for all other sports, coaches may send you brochures, you can get recruiting materials, information on camps that are available at the school, but they actually cannot contact you via phone. They cannot call you, but if you were to call them, they can answer. There's also information in regards to official visits and unofficial visits, meaning whether or not the university can pay to bring you to campus to view the university. And that information will tell you the timeline of when those are available. So next we'll talk about how to navigate this process. As I said, a lot of international students choose to use recruiting services to help them find placement at a university, but it's not a requirement. So just know that you can do this on your own, and this is just a few of the best practices about how to do that on your own. So I always encourage students to promote themselves, because as little there are very few student athletes who actually are recruited by coaches directly. And those are typically in a lot of the high profile sports like American football and basketball. But everyone else really contacts the coaches on their own and self promotes themselves on their own. So if you go to a university's website, so say you're interested in one particular university, if you pull up their university website and click on their athletic department page, you'll find a tab for staff directory, and that's where you can actually find all of the email addresses for the coaches on staff, and that's where you can get contact information to reach out to a coach at a university. And don't always email just the head coach, always consider assistant coaches as well that are helping in the recruiting process. But I recommend sending an email with any videos or highlights that you have to the university coaches, and we'll talk more about what to send in a moment. Also, do your research when trying to decide what university that you want to attend. As I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of schools that offer sports scholarships in the US. So find out, does that school offer a program academically that you're interested in? Is it somewhere that has a degree that you are interested in achieving? Look more into the level of the university to see if you'll fit in academically. And just be sure to consider athletics and the time commitment. So on average, an incoming freshman student athlete, meaning that first year of university, typically only has roughly 17% of their week being their own personal free time. That means it's a very structured learning environment where the students are getting up early and they're going to morning practice and then breakfast and then classes all day and then lunch and more classes and then afternoon practice. And then most universities' athletic teams freshman year require what we call mandatory study tables. And that is time per week, a certain number of hours per week that in the evening you're required to be in the library with the team studying and doing your homework to make sure that you're keeping up your grades. So they are going to be watching very attentively, taking attendance in classes to make sure you're attending your classes, making sure you're keeping your grades up, because these are all things that have to be done in order to keep your scholarship. And then also just consider the intangibles. Where is the university located? Is it in a large town? Is it in a small town? Is it in a big or small city? And what is going to feel best for you? What's going to feel like home? And just be sure to remember to ask coaches if they are offering you a scholarship, have those real conversations with the coaches to say, is the scholarship that you're offering me a full scholarship? So the coaches can also offer partial scholarships, which would not cover everything. So a full scholarship typically covers your tuition, your housing, your food, and all of those expenses. Your books would be covered with a full scholarship, but partial scholarships may not cover everything. And so you'll want to be sure to have those conversations with coaches to find that out. It's also important to know what are the admissions requirements. What does the athletic training and medical expenses look like? Is that covered as well? What academic resources are available? So does the university offer tutors and academic advisors for you? And then to look at the time demands and then ask about injuries. It's important to say, if I get hurt, what is the rehabilitation process at your university? What is offered to me to help me get better? So those are important conversations to have with the coaches. So what you should send to the school would be, if you're going to email coaches or assistant coaches, just give them a little bit of background about yourself and your interest in their team, and give them a brief academic history of you. Just, if you've taken the TOEFL or the SAT, what the scores are, what diploma that you'll be earning. Coaches like to know that information so that when they work with their university to determine if you would be a good fit, they have that little snapshot of where your academics are right now. And then a sports resume with any statistics or results, such as any times or scores for sports like swimming, track, golf. tournament results for sports like golf and tennis. If you're ranked on any websites within your country or region, providing links to those websites for the coaches is always important. But then showing the strength of the field. So list who you beat, who beat you, especially if those names are more familiar to US coaches and you've competed against them. It's good to list that type of information as well. And any YouTube videos that you have of like highlights of you, you can include that, but also just include a few minutes of actual play time, because coaches like to see how you are in a match or a game in addition to those highlight videos. So just from a reminder that there are various offers that can be given to you from an NCAA school, those full or partial scholarships. If you're a recruited walk-on, that means that you may have been offered a spot on the team, but there is no scholarship tied to that, which means that you are going to have to pay your own way through university. So just keep that in mind. And then an unrecruited walk-on or a tryout would be someone who shows up to university, comes out for open tryouts, and makes the team, or maybe doesn't make the team, but there's no discussion beforehand with the coach, and again, no scholarship in that first year. And then lastly, here's our contact information. So if you visit our website, we actually have a contact form, and that is where you can send in any questions, and a member of our staff will respond to you and email you back and help provide further information. So if you aren't sure about a specific academic requirement for your country, or have any concerns about a recruiting service that you're working with, or anything that you're considering signing, I always recommend reaching out to our staff so one of them can work with you to just make sure that everything that you're doing is still maintaining your possibility for earning a scholarship in the future. And that is the end of our presentation today. So I will send it back over to Uta and see if maybe we had any questions.
Elizabeth, thank you very, very much. If you may mute your phone. So I hope we're not getting feedback anymore. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. This was really wonderful and a lot of condensed information. We do have a few questions, and I think the first one was somewhat already answered. This is, do you provide scholarships, or is sailing an NCAA eligible sports?
Yes, correct. So sailing would be more of a club sport, but it would not be an NCAA sport. There just aren't as many universities that can support sailing. So for the universities that do support it, it would be considered a club sport, which may mean there may still be scholarship opportunities. It's just not tied through the athletic department. It may be through a private donor at the university, or, you know, if a university has a sailing program and they have raised funds for that. So it's definitely still an opportunity. It's just that this process and these academic requirements and amateurism would not pertain to sailing. You would just want to look more into that university's sailing program and see what specifically they require to achieve any possible scholarships with them.
Thank you for that answer. And the next one is, do you submit transcripts to NCAA at the end of year 12 or yearly?
Great question. So what we recommend students to register earlier than later. So we will actually ask that you do it as early as year 10 or year 11, because if you're being recruited by a university, we actually have a process called preliminary evaluations, and that's where we can review your coursework from years 9, 10, and 11, and calculate what we call a preliminary GPA. So an early GPA to see how many of the 16 core courses do you have at the end of year 11. Where does your GPA stand? So we also recommend taking that SAT or ACT sometime in year 11 so that we can do that preliminary evaluation before year 12 or at the beginning of year 12 so that you know if you're missing any core courses, what you need to make up in that final year, or also if you need to bring your GPA up, you would know that at that time. So we recommend if you can send them earlier, and then what will happen is you would need to send again your final year. So you could send 9, 10, and 11 at year 11, and then once you graduate, you could send year 12 and your diploma.
Okay, and next question. What about countries where military service is required? Is that considered a gap year too?
Great question. So recently, within the past probably 5 years or so, the NCAA did accept or did adopt an exception for countries with mandatory military service where that does not count towards their gap year. That would not hurt them for taking longer off after university if their country had mandatory military service. Good question.
One of the people is asking if we could share the presentation. We will certainly make the recording available, but I don't know, can we also share the presentation?
I believe so, but the information is also available on our website, but I think you're going to share the recording, which will be the way to share the presentation, correct? Yes. Perfect.
I don't have any other questions waiting right now, but maybe you can answer a question for me, which came up. What about maximum playing seasons? You mentioned that, but I'm not really sure that all of our audience really understands about the maximum.
Thank you. So what that means is that every student who has full eligibility goes into university with what we call a 5-year clock. So you have 5 years to complete 4 years, and that clock starts when you become a full-time university student. And for Division I, it does not stop. So if you start in 2015, it ends in 2020, and that would be the end of it. And how that works is that if you got injured your first year or you did what we called redshirting, you weren't academically eligible to participate, but still eligible to receive the scholarship money. You could sit out and just practice with the team that first year and then still play for 4 years after that. So some students will get their university degree in 4 years and then in the fifth year go on to even get a year of graduate school paid for. So there are possibilities that that's really beneficial to a student. So for Division II, you still have that 5-year clock. It's just that it's 5 years or 10 semesters of university enrollment. So it doesn't like stop versus like Division I, once it starts, it can't stop. Division II, you could actually attend for 2 years, take a year off, come back, still have the 3 years. So that clock really impacts the participation portion of it, impacts Division I the most. So it's just important to make sure that you know about the clock. So if you're a full-time university student at a university outside of the US, enrolling full time still starts that clock. So that's something to take into consideration.
Actually, that was the next question from somebody who had audio problems and was wondering. He or she attended college or university in Portugal, and they was wondering if they were. It's possible to be eligible for a sports scholarship, being already a college student in my country, which was Portugal. So you almost answered it, but just to confirm, yes.
Yes, so how that would work is it would just depend on when you were expected to graduate high school and when you enrolled at university. We would look at your sports participation and then also how long you've been a university student. So if you started university 5 years ago or 4 years ago, you may not have any eligibility left, but it just depends on how long you've been a student.
Which actually brings me to a question again. What about graduate students? If they like finished a bachelor's degree outside the US and wanted to go to US and be a NCAA scholarship student on the graduate level, so that would still, the clock would still be the 5 years. So it would have to be within these 5 years.
Correct. So that's how some students are able to typically have 1 year of graduate school paid for if they still had one of their 4 years left in that 5 year clock. But typically beyond that, graduate students would not be eligible for sports participation or scholarships due to that 5 year clock time.
With the European bachelor being 3 years, they actually may have two left then, if a graduate school would admit them.
Yes, that would be correct.
More question. When should students start writing to coaches? How early should they start?
It really depends on the sport. A lot of students, it will be what we consider to be the summer after sophomore year, or year 10 within your country. But just know that the coaches may not be able to respond, but just making them aware of you from an early age is always good. So as early as year 9 and year 10, you could begin to send information showing your interest if you want to be really aggressive about trying to get a scholarship opportunity. But it may not be until year 11 or junior year that that coach can actually respond to you. So just keep that in mind.
Just checking out the questions here, but I believe we have most of them covered. Any other questions? Anything occurring to you? Let us know. We are almost also, we still have a few moments left. Anything else we maybe could revisit, or questions that we could discuss?
So a few things that are coming soon to just keep in mind. This presentation did have a link to our website, eligibilitycenter.org. You'll see that in the bottom right on the slide that's up right now. And we're getting ready to launch in the next month or so a new international web page that just makes it a little more user-friendly to navigate. So what will happen is when you pull the web page up, the countries will be aligned by continent. So if you're from Europe, you would click on Europe, South America on South America, and then you'll find your country. And when you pull up the information on your country, if we have any recorded student athlete testimonials, meaning if a student athlete from your country has done a recording with us to talk about their experience, we're going to be posting those there. We're also working to expand the translations of our resources. So currently we have Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and then we have a Russian version coming soon. So we're just working to continue to expand those resources. So if you're from a Spanish-speaking country, when you click on your country, you'll see a link to the resources in English and in Spanish for you and your parents and your school. It's just an easier way to read through our information. Also, I talked about that international guide, which has over 140 countries in it. That means it's a very large document. It's about 450 pages long. So on the new web page, will actually be extracting just your country's information onto the web page for your country. So you'll be able to download a free PDF that may only be 2 or 3 pages long with the information that's specific for your country. So just keep an eye out for that over the next month or so when you'll see that launch, but that's a way to just have more personalized resources for your country. And then we're also working over the next year, probably in the spring, to develop a few sport-specific resources of best practices. So for example, football or soccer and tennis are the 2 largest international sports. So we have the most students internationally from those 2 sports. So we're working to develop a few resources specific to those with reminders. So I talked about that gap year. That gap year pertains to almost all sports except for tennis. Division I tennis only has a 6-month gap period. And what that means is that if you graduate high school in June of 2018, you would only have until December of 2018 to continue to compete in organized competitions or matches for tennis. Any competing beyond December and not enrolling full-time at a university will lose you seasons of eligibility at an NCAA school. So what that means is that if a student chose to take a full gap year, that second 6 months could hurt them as far as the amount of eligibility that they have. So we're working to develop a few resources specific to sports just because we know they're so popular in the international community, and we want to have those available to educate everyone. So if you're a student interested in tennis, just keep in mind that for Division I there is a gap period.
We have 2 more questions, and Darinka is asking, can a student lose eligibility and how?
So that's a great question. So there's initial eligibility, which we talked about today. And then once you attend university, the universities on campus will monitor your academic progress and your behavior on campus to make sure that you maintain that scholarship. So not only do you maintain it academically by meeting the continued requirements of the university, 1 being your GPA, 2 being your progress towards degree. So you have to complete a certain number of credits every year to progress towards earning your degree at the end of your time at the university. The other would be the code of conduct that you sign with the team. So you're going to sign saying every university's conduct kind of contract is slightly different, but you're signing saying that you will attend classes regularly, you will attend practice with the team, study tables with the team. You also sign saying that you will not use any drugs or illegal substances or steroids. So if you do any of those things, you could ultimately lose your scholarship with the university.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And also there's a question from Agnieszka. She's asking if we could go back to the page contacting the coaches schedule. The coaches, how to the contacting the coaches. Maybe, yeah, one more and one further.
This is the slide for the what to send to coaches. Right?
But there is a time when they cannot, the coaches cannot.
The recruiting calendar. I apologize. So this one is just an example of what that calendar looks like for Division I for students who are sophomores. But keep in mind that link there for the guide to the college-bound student athlete, which if you go to our website, there's a little FAQ, it's called frequently asked questions link, and you can type in guide to the college bound student athlete, and that will pull up the link, or if you have access afterwards to the hyperlinks here, where you can view that guide, and it's several pages long, and about halfway through is where you'll find all of the recruiting calendars.
Okay. actually more coming in. My son has dual citizenship, Belgian, US. Is there a preference of citizenship he should be apply register with? So he's US Belgian.
That's a great question. We actually don't ask anything about citizenship in this process. So we're looking at the academics, what diplomas the students are earning, what grades they're receiving, but the citizenship has no impact on the eligibility process at all.
Thank you, Johan, for that question. And okay, that was just Agnieszka commented it's page 27 apparently on that in that guide, student guide. So she's looked it up. Thank you, Agnieszka. And there was, maybe I'm missing. No, I think this seems to be the last one. Yeah, our time is also up. If you have one, oh, there's one more coming in. Is it necessary to make SAT exam being an international college student? I believe that question was answered.
A very good question. So if you have already enrolled full-time at a university anywhere in the world, we can no longer use an SAT score taken after you have become a university student. So for NCAA initial eligibility, we would be looking at an SAT or ACT taken prior to full-time university enrollment. Once you become a full-time university student, then your eligibility is based on transfer eligibility. So the university you're transferring to is going to be looking at your GPA and how many credits you've completed at the university level. Great question.
Yeah, I misunderstood. I think then we're going to make this the last question. I want to thank everybody very much for attending. I hope you got everything out of it that you wanted to. And thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. It was a great pleasure having you here this afternoon and giving your expertise to our audience here. So goodbye from Berlin, and we hope to see you in the United States practicing your sports.